G'day, I'm Garry Stevens, and welcome to the second series of the History in the Bible podcast. More of the history in more of the books in all the Bibles. Welcome to the second and final series of the History in the Bible. I kick off with this, episode 2.1 in Babylon 1, the Exile. Did you miss me? No? So sad. I missed you. In this series, I will survey the entire period from the exile to the writing of the last books of the New Testament. More of the history in more of the books in all the Bibles. You may think the exile an odd place to start my second series, but let me run over my reasons again. This is the Second Temple period, named after the temple that Ezra and Nehemiah and the exiles from Babylon constructed to replace Solomon's temple. The Jews were ruled successively by Babylon, Persia, the Greek kingdoms and Rome, with a brief period of tumultuous independence under the Maccabean kings. The Second Temple period spawned a luxuriant Jewish literature, dozens and dozens of books with radically new ideas. None of these books made it into the Jewish canon, and few into the Christian, although many of their ideas became foundational to Christianity. The books written after the exile that Jews and Christians include in their Bibles have much more in common with this Second Temple literature than with all the books written before the exile. A great example is the book of Daniel, which scholars are convinced was written in Hellenistic times, long after its setting in Babylon. After much argument, rabbinic scholars squeaked it into the canon. If you think of the book of Daniel as the last great Old Testament prophet, it is a very peculiar beast indeed. If you think of it as one of the earliest of the Second Temple books, it stands at the head of a long line of religious thinking. The exile is the great rupture. The Second Temple period is the penultimate stage in the development of modern rabbinic Judaism and the crucible of Christianity, which makes it a grand place to start my second series. Let's get to it. At the end of Series 1, we left the Judeans deported to Babylon or seeking refuge in Egypt. The last king of Judah, Zedekiah, was blinded. His sons were dead. The holy city was in ruins, the holy temple in rubble. Judah remained a small province of the Babylonian Empire for almost 50 years, from the time of the second sack of Jerusalem in 586 BC to the fall of the empire in 538. How many marched to Babylon and how many stayed behind? This is a point of major contention in contemporary biblical studies. The Bible says that there were either 2 or 3 deportations. First, after the initial capture of Jerusalem in 597 BC. Second, after the destruction of the city in 586. And finally, a bonus deportation 5 years later, well into Babylonian rule. The books of Kings and Jeremiah provide figures and dates for the deportations, but they don't agree. In the first deportation, one verse in Kings tells us that 10,000 were deported. In another verse, it tells us that 7,000 were taken. Kings also says that most of the remaining population fled to Egypt after the assassination of the first Babylonian governor, Gedaliah. Jews had first migrated to Egypt sometime during the reign of King Josiah, a few decades before the fall of Judah. Many served as mercenaries in Egyptian campaigns against the southern Nubians. The refugees after the Babylonian conquest bolstered their numbers. Like immigrants throughout time, they continued in the occupations of their pioneering forebears. Rather than opening a laundry or a bagel shop, these new immigrants became soldiers. They garrisoned the island of Eleven near Aswan at Egypt's southern border. This colony is unrecorded in any history. We only know it through the discovery of a trove of documents in the late 19th century. The soldiers kept many of their ancestral practices, including the Sabbath and Passover. But they also made oaths in the names of other gods from the Levant, Anat, Sati, Bethel. During Persian times, they built a temple to Yahweh, which they modelled on the temple in Jerusalem. The book of Jeremiah quotes precisely 3,486 people taken in the first two deportations, and mentions a third deportation, in which a further 745 Judeans were taken to Babylon. Call it 4,500 all up. Against both Kings and Jeremiah, Chronicles implies that the entire province was depopulated, the empty land concept. The biblical texts are telling us inconsistent stories. We can't tell if just the elites were deported or almost everyone. The Book of Kings talks only about the political elites, warriors and craftsmen. Chronicles throws in everyone, down to the poorest peasant. And when the Bible talks about population numbers, you can never know if it is talking about just adult men or men, women and children. The best we can say from the Bible's evidence is that somewhere between a few thousand and 20,000 were taken to Babylon. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists bought into the chronicler's empty land idea against the Book of Kings. There was clear evidence of destruction layers in Jerusalem and all the fortified settlements to the south and west. As the Book of Lamentations said, Judah was a desolation, Jerusalem uninhabitable. Judah was also a cultural wasteland. No scribes, no culture, no religious activity. In the 1990s, all that was turned on its head. Comprehensive archaeological surveys seemed to indicate that the population of Judah before the Babylonian invasion was something like 75,000, of which Jerusalem contained 15,000. If only 20,000 were deported, then perhaps 3/4 of the people were left behind, some 55,000 in the rural areas. I'll call that the chock-a-block theory. By the year 2000, a sizable camp of academics believed that Judah was no wasteland, but a diminished version of the Old Kingdom. All agreed that the city of Jerusalem was almost annihilated. The majority held that rural life and in the towns followed the ancient rhythms of the centuries. Babylon had decimated the great cities and deported a few social elites. But for most of the people, life continued. The religion of Yahweh was alive and well in the land of its birth. To that consensus, there has been a counter-reaction in the past 15 years, a return to the empty land theory. Under that theory, perhaps 10,000 were left behind. A major issue is that we can find almost no Judean artefacts in Judah from the 50 years of the Babylonian rule. Does this mean the land was devastated, or we just aren't looking hard enough? Most archaeologists now believe that the Babylonians scorched the earth. Judah was left with perhaps 15 to 20% of the population ruled by good King Josiah 30 years before. Still, the debate continues. What archaeology cannot tell us is the reason for the depopulation. How many Judeans were deported? How many actually died from starvation, disease, plunder, and warfare during the years in which Babylon's armies marched through the land? We simply don't know. We also know little about the life of the exiles in Babylonia. While we have a wealth of material in the books of Chronicles and Kings, and the Assyrian and Babylonian records for the period of the two kingdoms, we have very little for the 50 years of Babylon. A few verses in Kings and Chronicles, some chapters in Jeremiah, and of course Ezekiel, who had been taken to Babylon in the first sack of Jerusalem. The Babylonian chronicles break off a few years before the final fall. When they resume, they say nothing that helps us to understand life in Judah and in Babylon with the exiles. There is one notable exception. In the late 20th century, a treasure of 100 cuneiform tablets was unearthed from the Jewish settlement of Al-Yahudu in the heart of Babylonia. They only made their way into the hands of scholars a decade ago. These tablets are a collection of commercial and legal transactions written by the Jews in exile, in Akkadian and Hebrew. We know they come from the time of the exile, thanks to the lawyers and accountants who wrote them. Each tablet is dated according to the year of the reigning monarch. From these tablets, we know that the Jews received land to till and sites to settle in. They were prosperous members of the community, not downtrodden prisoners of Babylon. As tenants to the king, they would have paid taxes and served in the military. Some became soldiers in the army. Others became trusted bureaucrats to the king. The book of Ezra records that they had silver vessels with gold, with goods, with livestock, and with precious objects. They even had their own slaves. Ezekiel is the great prophet of the exile. His name seems to mean something like El, God, makes strong, or El will be strong. His book is one of the longest in the Old Testament, at 30,000 English words and 48 chapters, about as long as Psalms. In Jewish Bibles, Ezekiel is included in the middle section of the Tanakh, prophets, placed in historical order after Jeremiah. That Ezekiel made it into the prestigious collection of the prophets, rather than the last section called the writings, argues that the book was accepted as legitimate early on. The book of Daniel, always regarded by the Jews as vaguely dodgy, never made it into the prophets and was relegated to the writings. In Protestant Bibles, the book of Lamentations is squeezed in between Jeremiah and Ezekiel. The Catholics and Orthodox also insert the book of Baruch between the two great prophets. Both Lamentations and Baruch are associated with Jeremiah. The book of Ezekiel describes the prophet as the son of a priest, deported to a Jewish colony on the river Chebar in Babylon, along with the short-lived puppet king of Judah, Jehoiakim, also called Jeconiah. I went through that history in episode 1.54, The Babylonian Conquest of Judah. That was in 597 BC. The book records he began his prophetic mission 5 years later, in 592, and continued to work for 22 years. That means he would have heard of the destruction of Jerusalem a few years into his ministry in exile. In an unusual display of unanimity, scholars have no argument with the book's authorship or provenance. It was written by a priest named Ezekiel at the time and in the place when it says it was. The book divides naturally into a few chunks. The first few chapters announce his prophetic call in what can only be described as hallucinogenic imagery. Another 20 chapters denounce Judah's apostasy and idolatry. He cautions the people against the false hope of rescue from the Egyptian army. The Jews must accept their punishment by Babylon. Ezekiel exhorts them to repent for their unfaithfulness to God. He spends an especially fulminating few chapters announcing God's judgments on 7 heathen nations: Ammon, Moab, Edom, Philistia, Tyre, Sidon, and Egypt. These chapters seem to have been written before the final destruction of Jerusalem. Having written the first part of the book, the prophet must then have received news of Jerusalem's obliteration. Ezekiel now had a terrible task to fulfill. The prophets and the Deuteronomist, the author of the books from Deuteronomy through Kings, had argued that the fate of the nation depended on its fidelity to God. The authors of Kings and Chronicles time and again describe the kings of the northern kingdom of Israel as wicked apostates who rebelled against God's chosen king David. The destruction of Israel at the hands of Assyria was its just punishment. Those writers had rather more difficulty explaining the end of Judah, as God had many times stated that a Davidic king would reign in Judah forever. It was Ezekiel's job to make sense of it all. He insists that the Jews must continue their relationship with God in spite of the tragedy. God will uphold the covenant with Israel for the sake of the sanctity of the divine name, by restoring a remnant of the people to Judah, and by creating a new temple. God will save his people, but in some indeterminate future. By far the most striking and influential chapter in the book of Ezekiel is its hippy-trippy first chapter. The opening verse sounds very much like an appearance by the storm god Baal, whom the Hebrews later assimilated to their own god Yahweh. Quote, Ezekiel 1:4. I looked, and lo, a stormy wind came sweeping out of the north, a huge cloud and flashing fire, surrounded by a radiance, and in the centre of it, in the centre of the fire, a gleam as of amber. End quote. We've seen this before in the book of Exodus. Read all about it in episode 1.15, Exodus, the contract with God at Sinai. Then follows a description unlike anything in the Bible. The prophet dares to describe and unveil the divine presence, a presence that Exodus cloaks in a cloud. Long quote, Ezekiel 1:5. In the centre of it were also the figures of 4 creatures. Each had 4 faces, and each of them had 4 wings. The legs of each were fused into a single rigid leg, and the feet of each were like a single calf's hoof, and their sparkle was like the lustre of burnished bronze. They had human hands below their wings. The 4 of them had their faces and their wings on their 4 sides. Each one's wings touched those of the other. Each of them had a human face at the front. Each of the 4 had the face of a lion on the right. Each of the 4 had the face of an ox on the left. And each of the 4 had the face of an eagle at the back. As I gazed on the creatures, I saw one wheel on the ground next to each of the 4-faced creatures. As for the appearance and structure of the wheels, they gleamed like beryl. All 4 had the same form, and when they moved, each could move in the direction of any of its 4 quarters. They did not veer when they moved. Their rims were tall and frightening, for the rims of all 4 were covered all over with eyes. Wherever the Spirit impelled them to go, they went, and the wheels were borne alongside them, for the spirit of the creatures was in the wheels. When those moved, these moved, and when those stood still, these stood still, and when those were borne above the earth, the wheels were borne alongside them, for the spirit of the creatures was in the wheels. End quote. The composite creatures of human, lion, ox, and eagle were commonplace through the Middle East. You can find many examples from Assyrian art. The Hebrews adopted and reinterpreted them as cherubim, creatures guarding the Ark of the Covenant in the Tabernacle of Moses. Check out episode 1.16, Exodus 4, Origins of the Old Israelite Religion, for more info. Christian tradition came to associate Ezekiel's creatures with the Gospel writers. The human face was Matthew, the lion Mark, the ox Luke, and the eagle John. Christian artists for centuries, from Raphael to William Blake, have tried to make sense of Ezekiel's first chapter, but not with much luck. Later Jewish tradition was horrified at Ezekiel's vision of God. No one else had attempted to depict the presence in such living detail. But once the book of Ezekiel was accepted into the canon, it remained impervious to removal. Many centuries later, at the height of the Roman Empire in about 200 AD, the great Jewish legal digest, the Mishnah, demanded that the first chapter of Ezekiel be expounded to only one person at a time, and then only if he, and it was always a he, was of mature age and a sound scholar. The Mishnah was right to be worried. At the time the digest was written, that opening chapter of Ezekiel had inspired a whole new movement in Judaism. We call it today Merkavah, or chariot mysticism. The first chapter of Ezekiel says nothing of a chariot, but the mystics decided that Ezekiel was indeed describing a chariot, led by 4 beings. The aim of the students of the chariot mysticism was to follow Ezekiel in ascent to explore the heavens and beyond the face of God. The chariot mystics in turn inspired another mystical literature. I'm not sure how it's pronounced, but it's written Hekalot or Hekalot, and Hekalot or Hekalot means palaces or chambers. These stories describe ascents to heaven through a series of palaces. It's rather like Dante's Divine Comedy, but in reverse. Neither the chariot nor the palace literature had anything to say about a Messiah, or the end of days and the world to come, or a resurrection of the dead, or the restoration of Israel. They were all about humans gaining greater knowledge of the Godhead by approaching his very throne. We only have a few tantalizing documents where this mysticism was preserved in some bulk. One of these books is the Hebrew work, the Book of Palaces, also known as the Book of Rabbi Ishmael, the High Priest. Modern scholars call it Third Enoch. From the abundance of manuscripts we have, it must have been a bestseller. The book claims to have been written by Rabbi Ishmael, who died in the 1st centuries AD. Unfortunately, the traditions are confused as to whether that is the Rabbi Ishmael who was a high priest of the temple just before the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, or the renowned scholar Rabbi Ishmael from the next generation. Whatever tradition says, we can only trace the text back to the last century of the Roman Empire. In 3rd Enoch, the rabbi passes through 6 heavenly palaces, one within the other. For his final ascent, the rabbi is guided by the archangel Metatron, prince of the divine presence, God's personal valet. Or is that valet? I never know. In a surprise twist, Metatron reveals that he is none other than the antediluvian patriarch Enoch, the man who never died. If you want more on the mysterious Enoch, check out episode 1.9, Tales of the Flood. In 13 chapters, Metatron bores Rabbi Ishmael to sleep, recounting how the human Enoch transformed into the most senior archangel. Ishmael perks up in the remaining 32 chapters, where Metatron discourses at length on the organisation of the heavenly household and the hierarchies of angels. The archangel concludes with a sparkly description of numerous heavenly marvels. Books like 3rd Enoch democratised the ascent to heaven. Anyone could do it if you prepared yourself. The chariot and palace devotees were clearly organised and participated in mystic rituals. Perhaps adepts prepared for a few days with fasting and maybe a magic mushroom or 3. They rhythmically sang hymns, prayers and invocations to drop into some sort of trance. The rabbis in late antiquity were deeply suspicious of the chariot and palace mystics and their crazy books. The trances the adepts fell into could only be demonic possession, not divine possession. While the books were orthodox in that they were monotheistic and paid due respect to the law of Moses, they teetered on the cliff of heresy. The all-too-human Enoch becomes an angel. Well, that was dubious for a start. Come to think of it, the rabbis said, the whole household of angels is looking a little too polytheistic, and these guys claim to have revelations unknown to Moses. No, said the authors of the Mishnah, we have all revelations that God gave to Moses right here in our shiny new Law Digest. You mystics are just confusing things. The rabbis never attempted to ban the mystics outright, but they did their best to contain them. Discussion in public of the 1st chapter of Ezekiel and of the chariot and palace literature was banned. some rabbis may have found the mysticism convenient and a sure way to career advancement. Where most of their fellows were lawyers and spiritual advisors, the mystical rabbis could claim to be as of the prophets of old, with a direct vision of God. The Jewish chariot and palace mystical movements died out sometime in the early Middle Ages. Their legacy is disputed. A few synagogue hymns may have been lifted from the mystics. They may have influenced Jewish German mysticism of the High Middle Ages and the Spanish Kabbalah. In the next episode of the History in the Bible, I conclude Ezekiel and discuss that most frustrating of books, Job. I'll see you then. Thanks for listening. For maps, charts, and diagrams, check out my website, www.historyinthebible.com.